Hey Casibang's crew, welcome to Unit 3. This is our learning unit, or behaviorism, otherwise known as behaviorism. There's 4 specific things that we're going to be learning about in this unit. The first one is classical conditioning. That's what we'll be doing today. And then we have operant conditioning, cognitive learning, and social learning theory. So let's first define what learning actually is. It is really any adaptation to our environment, okay? Relatively permanent change in behavior brought about by experience or by practice. So there's a couple things that happen when you learn new skills, when you learn new information. There's a part of your brain that is changed every time you learn something new. And the more that you practice that skill, or the more you practice that new knowledge, the wider, the stronger, the bigger that neural pathway is that is being changed in your brain. That's why I constantly want you to keep practicing, keep doing things. When you are playing a sport or you're playing a musical instrument, practice is so important. And that is because we are building these neural pathways. We are making them bigger and wider and stronger so that we can pull on that information when we need to. Any kind of change in the way an organism behaves is considered learning. All right, so behaviorism. We've defined behaviorism already, but it is an attempt to understand observable activity in terms of observable stimuli and observable responses. Notice I have observable in there 3 times. Okay? Behaviorism is all about what can be seen. They don't want to deal with any of that mental processes stuff that's part of our psychology definition. They only want to talk about behavior, what can be seen. There are 3 really important contributors to this idea of behaviorism. Ivan Pavlov was the first one. He wasn't even a psychologist. Okay, he was a physician. He was studying dogs, and he was studying digestive secretions in dogs, and he came upon something interesting that we now call classical conditioning. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. John Watson was next. He viewed psychology as a science, which is pretty much how we view it today. He said that we needed to study only behavior that could be observed. He did not want to study any unobservable mental processes. And then the last one is B.F. Skinner, and he is known for his research in operant conditioning. So we'll talk about him in the next video. All right, so classical conditioning is otherwise known as Pavlovian conditioning, based off of Ivan Pavlov, because he is the one that sort of discovered this phenomenon. So what he discovered is that an organism can come to associate 2 stimuli together. And through this association, they can learn something. So this is kind of a really sort of complicated and difficult definition that's on the screen here. But we're going to kind of go through it step by step so you'll understand. But basically, a neutral stimulus signals an unconditioned stimulus, begins to produce a response that anticipates and prepares for an unconditioned stimulus. So I know that means absolutely nothing to you right now, but we will come back to that in just a second, and I'll explain it. Okay, so there are actually a bunch of different terms that are really important for classical conditioning. These 4 are the really most important things. So you notice I have, for example, an unconditioned stimulus, and then I have the abbreviation UCS. When I have those abbreviations there, you need to know those as well, because they may show up on tests with just the abbreviation, and you need to know what that means. So the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned, think not learned. So if we change that word conditioned to learned, that might help you when you're looking at these trying to figure out what they mean. So unconditioned or unlearned stimulus is a stimulus that is automatically and naturally triggers a response. Okay, so happens automatically, as if by instinct. We don't have to learn it, it just happens. So for example, when you get like wind near your eye, or someone puts something towards your eye, you're automatically going to blink. Okay, that would be considered an unconditioned stimulus. Okay, something coming at your eye. The unconditioned response, or the UCR, okay, unconditioned, again, unlearned. So this is our unlearned, naturally occurring response to the unconditioned stimulus. So in my example, the unconditioned stimulus is something coming at your eye. That unconditioned response, or the unlearned response, is for you to blink or close your eyes. It happens automatically. We don't have to think about it. We didn't learn to do that. It's just automatic. The conditioned stimulus, or the CS, okay, so again, conditioned, we're going to change that to learned. So the learned stimulus is originally an irrelevant stimulus, something that didn't matter, but is after association with the unconditioned stimulus comes to trigger our conditioned response. And then the conditioned response, or the learned response, is the response to the previously neutral conditioned stimulus. So something that you should write down in your notes, kind of put an arrow from one to the other, maybe would be the easiest way to do it. But your unconditioned response and your conditioned response is usually the same. 99% of the time, that is going to be the same. Your unconditioned response and your learned response. And we're going to see that in a couple of examples in a second. All right, so keeping it all straight, okay? If you have to, and you will need to in your tests and your exam, you might be given a scenario and you need to figure out which one's the unconditioned stimulus and which one is the conditioned stimulus. What's the unconditioned response and which is the conditioned response? So the easiest way that I have found to do this is to ask yourself two questions. So the first question, is the event that I'm interested in a stimulus or a response? So that's going to get us halfway there, 50% of the way. So is it a stimulus, right, something that causes the response, or is it a response, something that happens because of the stimulus? So if the event is a stimulus, it's going to cause something else to happen, okay? So now you're 50% of the way. The second question, is the stimulus or the response something that was learned or something that occurs naturally as if by instinct? So is it something learned or is it something that naturally happens? So if the stimulus is something that causes the response automatically, naturally, then it's unlearned or unconditioned. If the response does not occur by instinct but has been learned through experience, it is a learned or a conditioned response. If the response happens the first time you ever encounter a stimulus as if by instinct, then it is unlearned or unconditioned. Okay? So you're going to remember those questions. We're going to use those questions a lot in class. Okay, so let's practice a little bit. Just choosing stimulus and response, or learned and unlearned. A puff of air is aimed at your eye and you blink. So here we're interested in the actual blink. So question, is this a stimulus or is it a response? Okay, blinking is in response to something. Okay. Question number 2, is it learned or is it unlearned? Okay, so now write it down on your paper. What is it? The UCS, the UCR, the CS, or the CR? All right, next practice. A picture of a piece of chocolate cake causes your mouth to water. We are interested in the actual picture of the cake. Stimulus or response? Okay, is it causing something or is it happening because of something else? Question 2, is it learned or is it unlearned? So write it down on your piece of paper. UCS, UCR, CS, or CR. Okay, 2 more practices. Your heart speeds up as you see a police car pulling up behind you. The event we're interested in is your heart speeding up. Stimulus or response? Learned or unlearned? Write it down on your paper. And then the last one, a loud noise causes someone to jump. The event we're interested in here is the loud noise. Stimulus or response? Learned or unlearned? Okay, make sure you write that down. We'll go over the answers in class. All right, so some of these terms, in terms of classical conditioning. So neutral stimulus, okay? A neutral stimulus is something that doesn't really matter, okay? It doesn't necessarily elicit any kind of response. Normally, before we talk about learning, the neutral stimulus elicits no reaction whatsoever. So you see that here, no reaction. The unconditioned stimulus or the unlearned stimulus will elicit a reflex action, okay? Something that happens automatic. When we pair the unconditioned stimulus with the neutral stimulus, and if we pair it often enough, it does require multiple times, but when we pair those two things together, those two things will now elicit that same reflex action. So after a while, that unconditioned stimulus, or the neutral stimulus changes into the conditioned stimulus, the learned stimulus. So now we've learned to elicit a conditioned response. And again, I'm going to give you some examples. If you're not following along, we're going to get some examples. Okay, here is the classic example. This is where Ivan Pavlov comes in because this is what happened. Okay, so he was working with his dogs. He was studying digestive secretions, so like saliva, okay, salivation. So he noticed that when dogs were presented their bowl of food, they would salivate, okay? Unconditioned response. It happened every time they saw their food or they smelled their food, okay? It was just an unconditional response for the dog. So what Pavlov did is as he was presenting the dog with his food, he also rang a bell. And the bell is a neutral stimulus, okay? The bell does not normally cause the dog to salivate, okay? It doesn't have any meaning. But when that bell was paired, you see this here, when that bell was paired with the food, okay, the dog starts salivating. They're really salivating because of the food, not really because of the bell. But Pavlov did this like many, many, many times over the course of many, many days. And eventually the dog learned that at the sound of the bell, they might be getting food. And then that causes them to salivate, right? So originally the bell is the neutral stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus or the unlearned stimulus is the food. The unlearned or unconditioned response is salivation. After many, many pairings, now the bell becomes our conditioned response. We've learned conditioned stimulus. We have learned to have a response. And then our conditioned response is the salivation. So remember how I said put an arrow from these two things? So more often than not, like 99% of the time, your unconditioned response and your conditioned response are going to be the same things. Okay? So this phase right here, this middle phase, is called acquisition. Okay? We are acquiring. Acquisition is acquiring. So we're acquiring the learning here. So the repeated pairing of the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus allows for the organism to acquire learning. All right, so here's a couple of things that they noticed over lots of research that kind of has to happen, and they happen pretty easily. Basic principles about classical conditioning. So the conditioned stimulus has to come before the unconditioned stimulus. Okay. The conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus have to come very close together in time. Okay. Ideally only a few seconds apart from each other. So that ringing of the bell and the presentation of the food has to happen like at the same time or within a second or two of each other. The neutral stimulus must be paired with that unconditioned stimulus several times, okay, many times, in order for that learning to take place. It doesn't always happen just like one time. It has to happen many times. And the conditioned stimulus is usually some stimulus that is distinctive or stands out from the other stimulus. So bell is completely different than food, okay? So it has to be distinctive. All right, so we have a couple of other terms that are really important in terms of classical conditioning. So acquisition, we already talked about. We're acquiring that learning. So acquisition is that repeated pairing of the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus so that the subject can learn. Extinction, okay, extinction. So if you think of extinction, that's why I put our little bird here. If you think of extinction as something going away, okay, so extinction can happen in classical conditioning as well. So we can diminish that conditioned response, okay, the salivation at hearing the bell, if the food is not presented after the bell. Okay, so it'll work for a little while, but after a while, the bell is going to lose its condition. It's going to lose its learning ability, and the dog will stop salivating. So that's called extinction. Generalization. Okay, generalization is when stimuli that are very similar to that conditioned stimulus. So in our Pavlov example, the bell. So if there's a stimuli that's very similar to that bell sound, so think maybe like instead of like ringing an old-fashioned bell, maybe it's a doorbell. So maybe the dog is going to salivate to a stimulus that's similar to the one that they originally learned. And that's called generalization. So we're generalizing our learning to a stimuli that's similar to the one that we already learned. And then spontaneous recovery. So spontaneous recovery happens when a subject has learned something. So in this case, we're going to use the dogs. Okay, they've learned to associate the bell with their food. So now they're salivating. And say they've only rang the bell and gotten no food many, many times. So now the dog is going through extinction. Okay, they're not salivating anymore. But you can have spontaneous recovery happen when you can have the reappearance of that learned response after extinction has occurred. So if you pair the bell and the food up again, then that learned response comes back almost immediately. That's that spontaneous recovery. Okay, remember, this shows that concept that learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior. So that's why this concept of spontaneous recovery is really important. So we say after a while, extinction will happen, but that pathway has already been created in the dog's brain. So we can make it come back by pairing the bell and the food back up again. Higher order conditioning happens when we have learning, okay, we have a strong conditioned stimulus paired with a neutral stimulus again, okay, so like learning on top of learning. So maybe this time, excuse me, maybe this time we're going to ring the bell and we're going to open a creaky cabinet and then they're going to get their food. Okay, so now after a while, the dog is going to salivate to not only the bell sound, but the sound of that creaky cabinet opening. So that's higher order conditioning, where we just have some learning happening on top of learning that's already there. Here's an example of the higher order or second order conditioning. So a cat, okay, here's the electric can opener for their food. Okay, so that's the conditioned stimulus. See, they've already learned that when they hear the electric can opener, they're going to get food, so they're going to start salivating. Okay, so they've already learned this. But now here's the squeaky cabinet that I just used. So the squeaky cabinet is where we keep the cat food. So with the squeaky cabinet's open, we pull the can of cat food out, and then we put it on the electric can opener. The cat is salivating. So now when you open the squeaky cabinet door, you don't even need to use the electric can opener. The cat is going to come running. They're going to be salivating. They know that food is coming. Okay, so that's that higher order conditioning. Okay, so we talk about classical conditioning more often than not in animals. And that's how it was discovered with Pavlov and his dogs. However, you can classically condition humans as well. And this is where John Watson comes into play. John Watson did a study which is called the Little Albert experiment. Okay, and it was on a little boy, a baby. And he discovered this conditioned emotional response, okay, abbreviated to CER. So this is an emotional response that becomes classically conditioned to occur to learned stimuli. So an example is fear, a fear of dogs, okay? Maybe you were bitten at a very young age by a dog, so now you have been conditioned to be afraid of dogs. Or any other emotional reaction that occurs when seeing an attractive person. Maybe your heart speeds up, okay? Conditioned emotional responses can lead to phobias, irrational fear responses. And we will talk more about this in the spring when we actually talk about phobias. But here is a picture, and we will in class watch a very short video of the classical conditioning happening on this little baby boy, little Albert. So little Albert had been conditioned to fear a white rat. When he was presented with this furry white rat, they clanged a really loud, like pipe against pipe sound that was really scary for him. So they conditioned this fear of the little white rat. And then he became afraid of other white fuzzy things. So it's kind of hard to tell in this picture, but he has like a white fuzzy rabbit mask on. So the white rabbit, a white fur coat. Yeah, so Watson did show that we can classically condition humans as well. But mostly in the area of like emotions or fear responses. And like I said, we will watch a video of this and talk a little bit more about it in class as well. Another form of classical conditioning that you guys may have experienced in your life is taste aversion. Okay, and it's a conditioned taste aversion. So you might develop nausea or any kind of aversive response to a particular taste because when you ate that thing or you drank that thing, you had a nauseous reaction. Okay, maybe you threw up after you ate it. So now you don't want to eat that ever again. So I always use the example of my oldest son. When he was little, loved Kraft macaroni and cheese. Okay, loved it. It was like almost every day, Mom, can I have Kraft macaroni and cheese? Well, then he caught just like a random stomach bug. And he had eaten Kraft macaroni and cheese for lunch. And then he had that random stomach bug and it made him, I don't know, he was like maybe 5 or 6 years old, and it made him like throw up all of the Kraft macaroni and cheese. And he has not touched Kraft macaroni and cheese since that day. Even though there wasn't anything wrong with the Kraft macaroni and cheese, it was just like a weird little stomach flu that he had gotten, he still developed that taste aversion right away. And taste aversions can happen one time, right? This isn't one of those situations in normal classical conditioning where you need to see that like neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus being paired up multiple times. Taste aversion can happen just once, and it is kind of hard to sort of get over it. So I think I wrote on your notes, come up with, if you've experienced this, write down your example. All right, so make sure that you are coming into class with questions. There's a lot of information, a lot you need to know and be aware of there. So make sure you come in with questions, and of course, we're going to do lots and lots of practice in class. All right, bye-bye. See ya.